Hey everyone, welcome back. Ready to dive into another juicy topic. Today, we're tackling a question we've all been wrestling with. Did Trump's policies really supercharge the economy, or was he just lucky to inherit a good situation? We're going deep on an analysis from the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities, so buckle up, because this is going to be interesting.
It's a fascinating debate, for sure, especially when you think about the totally different economic realities each president faced coming into office.
Oh, absolutely. Talk about a tough act to follow. Obama takes over in 2008, and the entire global financial system is basically going up in flames. The source calls it the worst financial crisis in history, even worse than the Great Depression. Unemployment through the roof, GDP in free fall. I mean, where do you even begin to fix something like that?
It's hard to overstate just how bad it was. The source says GDP dropped a whopping 8.4% in just one quarter. Imagine like a tenth of the entire country's economic activity just gone, practically overnight. That's the kind of impact we're talking about. Unprecedented, really.
Wow, okay, that really puts things in perspective. So the Obama administration basically had to try everything to get things back on track, right? Like, throw everything at the wall and see what sticks.
Pretty much. We're talking stimulus packages, the Troubled Asset Relief Program, TARP, financial reforms, saving the auto industry. They were pulling out all the stops.
Sounds intense. So, did any of it actually work? Or was it just damage control at that point?
Well, according to the analysis, research suggests that those actions weren't just temporary fixes. They likely prevented an even deeper, longer recession. So, yeah, I'd say they made a difference.
Wow, that's huge. So, fast forward to 2017, Trump takes office. And the economy isn't exactly on life support anymore, right? We've got job growth, unemployment's going down, things are looking up.
Exactly. And that's a crucial point. Trump inherited an economy that was already on the upswing. It wasn't stagnant. It wasn't declining. He wasn't starting from scratch, which makes comparing their economic records tricky. It's not exactly apples to apples.
Right, it makes you wonder how much of the economic growth under Trump was due to his policies, and how much was just, well, riding the waves of the recovery that was already underway.
That is the million-dollar question, isn't it? And it's something we'll definitely unpack as we dig deeper into the data.
Okay, so let's get into the numbers. You mentioned unemployment going down. How much did it actually drop under Obama?
We're talking a pretty dramatic shift. When he took office, unemployment was at a staggering 10%. By the time he left, it was down to 4.7%. So a significant decrease, and it translates to millions of jobs being added back into the economy.
Wow, that's huge. And the source mentions the economy kept adding jobs for 111 months straight, almost a decade of continuous job growth spanning both administrations. But Trump really loves to brag about the stock market, doesn't he? Like, that's his measure of success.
He does, but it's important to remember that the stock market isn't the whole story. It doesn't necessarily reflect the reality for everyday Americans who might not have a ton of money in the market.
That's a really good point. So while the stock market might have been doing well under Trump, it's not the be-all, end-all when evaluating the overall health of the economy, especially since, and this is where it gets interesting, the source points out that the stock market actually saw a bigger percentage increase under Obama than during Trump's first 3 years.
That's right. The numbers are pretty clear on that. We're talking a 140% increase over 8 years under Obama, compared to a 50% increase during Trump's first three. So even if you believe the stock market is a good indicator of the economy, the data doesn't necessarily back up the idea that Trump's policies were solely responsible for its growth.
It seems like there's more to this than meets the eye.
Yeah.
So we've established that Obama inherited a complete disaster and steered us toward recovery, leaving a more stable economy for Trump. The big question remains, did Trump's policies build on that and truly supercharge things, or was it more about lucky timing and inheriting a good situation?
That is the question. And to get to the bottom of it, we need to take a closer look at some of Trump's key economic policies, starting with those infamous tax cuts.
All right, let's unpack those tax cuts and see what kind of impact they really had. So those tax cuts, they were kind of a big deal, right? Trump's big economic promise.
Definitely a cornerstone of his agenda. He promised huge economic growth from them, higher wages, more jobs, the whole 9 yards.
Yeah, big, beautiful tax cuts. That was like his catchphrase. But didn't they actually go into effect like a year into his term, 2018?
That's right. Passed in 2017, but they didn't fully kick in until the following year. And that's important because by the time those tax cuts were actually in play, the economy was already doing pretty well, thanks to the groundwork laid in the previous administration.
So what you're saying is the economy was already seeing job growth, rising incomes, unemployment falling, all before the tax cuts could have really had an effect.
Exactly. It's kind of like, imagine giving a marathon runner a big energy boost, but they're already halfway through the race and going strong. Did they really need it to finish strong? Tough to say for sure.
Interesting analogy. Okay, but setting aside the timing for a second, did those tax cuts actually work as promised? Did we become an economic superpower overnight, like Trump said we would?
Well, the analysis we're looking at paints a bit of a mixed picture. In the short term, there's no denying that putting more money directly into the pockets of consumers and businesses can stimulate spending and investment, and that can lead to a temporary boost in economic activity.
Right, but that's like a sugar rush, isn't it? Doesn't last forever. What does the source say about the long-term impact?
And that's where things get a little fuzzy. See, a lot of economists argue that the initial sugar high of the tax cuts faded pretty quickly, and the promised long-term benefits, like sustained wage growth and a surge in business investment, they never really materialized to the extent that was predicted.
And I remember a lot of talk at the time about those tax cuts, blowing a hole in the federal budget.
Right, and that's the other side of the coin here. Those tax cuts weren't free. They added to the national debt, which the source points out could have some serious long-term economic consequences down the road, like throwing a lavish party on a credit card fund in the moment, but eventually, those bills come due.
Okay, so we got these tax cuts, maybe a temporary boost, but a big old bill coming due later. But those weren't the only big economic moves during Trump's time, were they? What about the trade war with China? That seemed like a pretty big deal.
Oh, absolutely. The trade war adds a whole other layer of complexity to this, and it definitely has to be factored in when we're assessing the overall economic picture.
Yeah, the tariffs. It felt like every other day there was a new headline about tariffs on something. But Trump insisted those tariffs were necessary to protect American jobs and businesses. So did they work?
Well, from what we're seeing in this analysis, it seems like, unfortunately, the trade war ended up hurting American businesses and consumers more than it helped.
Really? How so? I mean, I never really understood how slapping tariffs on goods from China was supposed to help the U.S. economy.
Well, the idea is that by making imported goods more expensive, it encourages consumers to buy American-made products instead, trying to level the playing field, or at least that's the theory. But in practice, tariffs often backfire. They might protect certain industries in the short term, but they also drive up costs for businesses that rely on those imported goods, which of course leads to
Higher prices for consumers. Yeah, I'm starting to see how this could backfire pretty badly.
exactly. And then, on top of all that, we have to factor in the retaliatory tariffs that China imposed on U.S. goods in response to Trump's tariffs.
Oh, right. I remember hearing about that, especially how it impacted American farmers. Weren't they hit particularly hard by those retaliatory tariffs?
Absolutely. China was a huge market for a lot of American agricultural products, and those retaliatory tariffs really hurt. Basically shut them out of a major export market overnight.
So we're talking about consequences that go way beyond just the specific goods that were targeted by those tariffs, huh? Like a ripple effect.
Exactly. It's this complicated web of interconnected consequences, and it's almost impossible to predict how it's all going to play out.
Okay, so the tariffs, another example of a policy that might have sounded good on paper, but the reality on the ground was a little different, maybe even had some negative unintended consequences. And according to this source, it sounds like those consequences included the loss of American jobs.
You got it. The analysis we're looking at suggests that the trade war had already eliminated 300,000 American jobs by late 2019, with predictions of even greater losses down the line. So much for an easy-to-win trade war.
300,000 jobs. That's a staggering number.
It is, and it really highlights the fact that tariffs are a double-edged sword. They can have unintended consequences that ripple throughout the economy, often hurting the very people they were supposed to help.
Okay, so let's recap for a second. We've got tax cuts that might have given a temporary boost, but also increased the national debt. And we've got a trade war that, at least according to this analysis, seems to have done more harm than good. Makes your head spin, doesn't it?
It's definitely complicated, no doubt about that. And it's tempting to try to isolate each policy, assess its impact in a vacuum. But the reality is economics is messy. There are always multiple factors at play, making it almost impossible to say with absolute certainty what caused what. It's like trying to untangle a giant knot.
That's a great way to put it. So where do we even go from here? How do we start to make sense of all of this? Yeah, it really is. It's like one of those 1,000-piece puzzles, but some of the pieces are missing, and the ones you do have don't quite fit right. So how do we make sense of this whole tangled web of policies and their impact on the economy? Where do we even begin?
Well, I think it's important to zoom out a bit, look at the bigger picture. We can't just focus on individual policies in isolation. We need to consider the economic context, the overall trends that were already in motion.
Okay, so let's zoom out. We've covered a lot of ground here. The Great Recession, Obama's policies to get us out of that mess, then Trump's big moves, the tax cuts, the trade war. We've seen how they might have had some positive short-term effects, but also came with some hefty costs, maybe some long-term consequences we're still figuring out. So what's the verdict? Did Trump really make America great again, economically speaking? Or was it more a case of being in the right place at the right time?
Well, based on what we're seeing in this analysis, it seems like a lot of the economic growth during Trump's presidency was really a continuation of trends that started under Obama. Remember, the economy was already on an upswing when he took office. Job growth, unemployment falling, the stock market recovering. It was already happening.
Right, those 111 months of job growth we talked about, that impressive streak, that wasn't all Trump, was it? Even though it happened during his presidency.
Exactly. That streak actually began during Obama's second term. And it's really tough, maybe even impossible, to say definitively how much of that continued growth was due to policies from Obama versus policies from Trump.
Like trying to separate two flavors of ice cream that have been swirled together. You can't really tell where one ends and the other begins.
Precisely. And that's why it's so crucial to avoid making sweeping judgments, like giving all the credit or all the blame to one person, one policy. The economy is just too complex, too interconnected for that. There are always multiple forces at work.
So where does that leave us? What are we supposed to take away from all of this?
That is the million-dollar question, isn't it? And honestly, I think it's one that each of us has to wrestle with individually. We've laid out the information, the different perspectives, the evidence from the source. Now it's about weighing that evidence and coming to your own conclusion.
No easy answers, huh? Just a lot to think about.
Exactly. But that's the beauty of engaging with these big, complicated issues, right? It's about looking beyond the headlines, digging into the details, getting comfortable with nuance and complexity. That's how we learn and grow.
It's about asking the tough questions, even when the answers aren't always crystal clear.
Couldn't have said it better myself. It's about understanding that there are multiple valid perspectives out there, and by grappling with those different viewpoints, we deepen our own understanding of how things work.
Love that. So, to our listeners, we've taken you on a deep dive into the American economy, the highs, the lows, the policies that shape it all. Hopefully, you've come away with a better understanding of this complex, always evolving system.
And maybe even more importantly, we've given you the tools to keep exploring this on your own. Dig into the research, ask your own questions, form your own conclusions.
Because knowledge is power. Thanks for going on this journey with us. Remember, the deep dive doesn't end here. Keep those brains buzzing, and we'll catch you next time.